This week, we continue our little series, My Struggles, My Strength, My Story. And kind of going back to last week as we were talking about darkness, today we're going to talk about the time is midnight in your life. And at midnight, we know it's dark. And at midnight, we know that we're still a little ways away from sunrise. We're a good bit away from sunset, but we're kind of like right there in the middle, midnight. The time is midnight. And if you go through the Bible, you can really find so many things that God accomplished at midnight. And all the way through the Old Testament, all the way through the New Testament. And this morning, we'll look at a story here in Acts chapter number 16. It says, beginning in verse number 22, the crowd rose up together against them, that's Paul and Silas, and the chief magistrates tore their robes and proceeded to order them to be beaten with rods. When they had struck them with many blows, they threw them into prison, commanding the jailer to guard them securely. And he, having received such a command, threw them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks. But about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns of praise to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. So I want to talk about midnight. Midnight this morning. Now, midnight is middle of the night, 12 o'clock, but midnight is the transitional period from one day to the next day. It's a time of transition in our world from PM to AM or vice versa. So it's a transitional time. So this morning, if you look at your life and maybe the time is midnight, maybe you're in a dark dungeon, maybe you're in a severe struggle and you've been there for a while, and it could be any phase, financial, relational, emotional, all kind of different categories, but it's midnight in your life. And one way to think about it in your mind is that God is up to something really, really big in your life, because we only go through those midnight experiences, those dark dungeons, when God is taking us and transitioning us and moving us further along in our relationship with Him, deeper in our relationship with Him, and maybe even going to use us in a greater, more powerful way. And He would have never been able to do that in our lives if it wasn't for that midnight time that you had to go through, that transitional period that you had to go through. You wanted it to be over. You want it to be over. You pray for it to be over. But God leaves you there for quite some time, to where you got to cling to Him, pray to Him, seek Him. But it's when the sun rises at the end of that midnight struggle in your life and in your family, God takes you from one phase to the next, and He's going to do something incredible in your life. This morning, the whole message centers on darkness and on midnight. But what do you do when darkness covers your life and it stays midnight for quite some time? What is your response? What do you do? In photography, the best work happens in the dark room. In the dark room, when the lights are out, that's where the real development takes place. That's where the negatives are turned into positives. That's where all those little clicks that were made are turned into these beautiful photos, these beautiful pictures. It's in the dark room. And in God's dark room and in our lives, that's where God does His real development. That's where God really takes our lives and really changes us. I mean, really moves in a powerful way. I've been cleaning a floor for the last 3 or 4 nights at different times. There's been a little break in between. But there's a floor at a restaurant, and it's kind of like a wood floor, and then we waxed on top of it, and then over the course of a couple of years, when the wax was reapplied, the floor wasn't all the way clean. So I started last Saturday night, and I was like, man, I'm just going to attack this thing. I had that simple green. I was putting degreaser out everywhere, and I made a mess. Horrible, horrible mess. Tried to come back the next morning, which was Sunday morning, and clean it up a little bit. Tried again on the next night, Sunday night, to make it a little bit better. But then I finally got what I needed last night. I got some stripper. Y'all like strippers? Some of y'all's eyes really got big there for a minute. I was like, man, I can tell what y'all like. You put that stripper down, and you know what it does? It starts eating away at the wax and eating away at the dirt. And then I just did a little bit last night because I had to go to bed. But you can go and you can see across one whole section of a floor, you can see that there are some parts of that floor that absolutely look like it did the day that it was put down. But then there's still other spots that need some more stripping. See, for that whole floor to look like the real thing, to look like it did when it was put down, there's got to be a lot of stripping and a lot of scrubbing and a lot of work. You see, in your life and in my life, for us to look like the real thing, Jesus, there's a lot of stripping that's got to take place. You can look down in your life right now, and other people can look in your life, and they can see that there are some areas, man, that looks like the real thing. Man, you look like Jesus right here. But as you look at the whole thing, at the whole picture, there's still a lot of areas in our life that's just not where it needs to be. So there's still so much more work that God has to do in us and through us. And there's some of those things, some of that dirty, rottenness, flesh that is there, that God has to put that stripper down on us, and it has to stay there for a while. We have to go through midnight sometimes, and midnight might last a week, it might last a month, it could last a year, it could last longer than that. We don't know how long it might last, but God is up to something in our lives, and He is making us more like Him. He's really trying to get us to the point in our lives to where we will completely depend on Him and completely trust Him. So this morning, what do you do when it's midnight? Do you worship Him? Do you pray to Him as Paul and Silas were? Do you praise Him in the storm and through the storm? Do you seek His face? Do you pray for wisdom? Do you pray for guidance? Do you pray, God, let this work that you have begun in me, God, complete it? I don't know what you're up to, and I can't understand it, but I will trust you and I will worship you all the way through it. You see, it's easy to worship at high noon, when the sun is shining bright. When everything is going good, your health is good, your finances are better than they've ever been, the family's more connected than it's ever been, everything just seems to be on the right track. It's a whole lot easier to worship at high noon than it is to worship at midnight. When there's pain, when there's pressure, when it's dark, when it's dreary, you're depressed, you're discouraged, you're overwhelmed, you can't see a way out, what do you do? Do you worship? Do you enter His presence? Or do you run away from it? Let's look right here. Point number one. Basically, I've already kind of covered some of this, but we look at the midnight moments. Now, let me share this. When I talk about midnight moments, I'm not talking about a lot of those little nagging trials that we go through in life. When I'm talking about midnight, I'm talking about those moments in your life to where you're just flattened. Those moments in your life to where you're just blown out of the water. There's a lot of struggles that we go through in life that are really inconvenient, really nagging, really irritating, but they're not really midnight moments. Midnight moments are those moments in our life that there is absolutely no way you and me as a human can fix it or solve it. You see, there's a lot of little nagging things we go through that we can handle, we can control, we can manipulate, and we can kind of work through it and not really ever even be obedient to God. But when midnight comes and your health is falling apart, or someone you love passes away, or there's the death of a marriage and a divorce is going to take place, or your kids have rebelled and they've gotten in some big trouble. When midnight comes, there is no fix that you can come up with. There is no answer to the mess that you find yourself in. You're in a dark, dreary dungeon fastened to this midnight moment, and your only help, your only solution is God. That's a midnight moment. Paul and Silas experienced this. Now, if you go back and read, beginning in verse number 16, you'll see that Paul and Silas were on their way to the place of prayer. Man, they were on their way to go pray for others and to pray to God. And there was this woman that was following behind them that was possessed with a demon spirit. And she had been following them around for several days. Paul eventually was so annoyed that he turned around and he said, "In the name of Jesus, come out of this woman." And the demon came out of this woman. But when the demon came out of this woman, the masters of that little servant girl realized that they couldn't make a profit off her anymore. So they were enraged. So they went and they seized Paul and Silas, brought them before the rulers and authorities. They were arrested, they were beaten, and they were thrown into a dark, dreary dungeon. And they had done nothing but serve God and honor God and lift God up. It wasn't fair. It wasn't just. It was unfair. It was unjust. I mean, there are some times in our lives to where we can be obeying everything God wants us to obey, and our life can still fall apart right before our very eyes. And God could be right in the middle of every bit of it, doing everything right. God led them to Macedonia where they were at. God led them to there to be doing what they were doing. So God already knew they were going to be arrested and beaten and scourged. God already knew they were going to be thrown into this dark dungeon. So we could say God led them there for this moment. You remember we talked about in week number 1 that there are going to be things that are going to come into your life. Some of them will be midnight moments. Some of them will just be various trials. But through every experience that we have, we've got the enemy over here who wants to blast us and beat us down and cause us to quit. And we've got God over here on the other side who is wanting to bless us and to build us and to make us like Him and to mark us as His very own disciples so that He can use us in a greater, more significant way. The enemy wants to blast you. God wants to bless you. Sometimes at midnight you're thinking, how in the world can God bless me through this? I mean, we can't see it. then. We can't see it when we're in the darkness and in the dungeon. We may be worshiping, we may be seeking God, we may be looking to Him, but we can't even wrap our heads around how in the world can God turn this tragedy, this pain, and all this pressure that I'm feeling in my life, how in the world can He turn it in to a blessing and use me in a greater, more powerful way? So many questions at midnight. How many times have we said, why me? Why us? Why this? Why now? All these questions, no answers, no explanations. We so desperately want to figure it all out. We want to know, we want to understand, but we can't. Some of you there this morning. If you're not there this morning, you've been there. That's the toughest thing about being a minister and having to try to come along someone and to pray with them, because at that very moment, if I can't even understand what God is doing in my life in a lot of ways, and I can't wrap my head around it, I most certainly can't in other people's lives. And I don't understand unfairness. I don't understand tragedies and pain and suffering and disease and death and all of that. All of that is here because of sin, and we're going to have to go through it. And there'll be so many things that we don't understand, and so many things we'll never have an explanation on. But I'm here to tell you the only way to get through those moments in your life is with God. The only way. He's always there for us, even when we don't see Him, even when we don't feel His presence, even when we're in that dark, dreary dungeon and we feel like we're a million, zillion miles away from the presence of God. He is there in that moment. See, God is taking you somewhere. You might not even be able to see where He's taking you, but He's taking you somewhere. He's moving you. You remember when Jesus told the disciples, we're going to get into the boat, and He said, let us go to the other side. Well, we know when they got out in the middle of that lake, they came up against a fierce storm. But Jesus has already told them, we're going to the other side. But there was a storm that was keeping them from the other side. Sometimes to get to the other side, we got to go through some storms. We got to go through some thunderstorms, some darkness. And you know that anytime there's a storm, I've been on the coast a few times because I'm a little bit crazy. I don't know if y'all realize it. I love hurricanes, and I love being right there in the mid. Just my adrenaline gets going. I know it sounds crazy, but I've been on the coast a few times when they were coming in, not a Category 5, but they were coming in, and when these storms come in, the wind starts to blow and it starts to rain, and a tornado can pop up at any second, just like that, out of nowhere. And you know what? It's the same way in our lives. You can be going along just fine, and then all of a sudden, just like that, the time is midnight in your life, and God has thrown down His stripper, and it is just sitting all over your life, and you just want it to end. But God has brought you, and He brings me to that moment because He's taken us somewhere. He's teaching us something, and He's telling you something. You know what He's telling you? He's telling you you can trust Him. You see, this is what God hates: pride more than anything. And a lot of times, especially when we're younger, we think that there's a lot of things that happen to other people that are never going to happen to us. And we may go years without anything happening in our life that we can't somehow try to handle and manipulate and solve. But I'm telling you, in every person's life, I don't care how much money you got, I don't care how much education you got, I don't care how many people that you know in high places, there are going to be things that are going to come in your life over your lifetime that there is no money that can solve, no education that can solve, there is no people in high places that can solve. Only God can solve them. When the doctor tells you you've been diagnosed with a disease, whatever it is, yeah, money might be able to help you get some things, but money can't heal. When your back is up against the wall, you may be able to get on the internet, and you may be an educated person, and you may be able to figure out a lot of different things educationally because your mind is so brilliant. But your mind being so brilliant can't solve the messed up life and the messed up relationship, and to be able to put it all back together and to be able to make it work better than it's ever worked before. God is telling us that we can trust Him. Second of all, not only the midnight moments, but second of all in this story we see the midnight musical. The musical, the celebration. Verse number 25 says, chapter number 16, it says, "But about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns of praise to God." Now get this. "And the prisoners were listening." Not only were the prisoners listening, there was someone that was commanded to guard them that was also right there with them, listening to everything that had been going on. The midnight moment, the darkness, they'd been beaten. Now think about it, been beaten. Man, they took a whip and just whipped them. Threw them in this darkness and fastened their feet and their hands. They couldn't even move. And all of a sudden, through the dungeon, you could hear echoing off of the rocks and off of the darkness a collection of music that was being heard. A collection of music with prayers to God, praising God, lifting up the name of God. In that dark, dreary dungeon, God was being lifted up and worshiped. Now, we know the story, so we know what happens. But when Paul and Silas were doing this, they didn't know that within a few hours an earthquake was going to take place. They didn't know God was going to set them free. You know what? They were having a midnight musical, and they were literally at the point of, "We will trust you, God. We will trust you. We will follow you. We will depend on you. And if it means we will die in this dungeon, we will die worshiping you." That's pretty serious. First of all, we just got to worship during that time. But did you know today, it's kind of like, you say, well, that don't happen today. You know there's more Christians today dying for their faith than ever before in history. Our media a lot of times don't want to talk about it, maybe because they're Christians, but there have been hundreds of them executed over the past year because they were Christians. And I'm sure they were scared and fearful, and I'm sure a lot of them died not of their own free will and their own free choice, but they had to give up their lives because of who they knew and who they were. Some of us don't even want to be inconvenienced, much less think about some persecution. Beaten, taken advantage of. Now, notice point A here. They were singing praises to God, first of all. Singing praises to God. Life crumbling, collapsing, falling apart, and they're singing praises to God. It's getting darker, they're overwhelmed, they don't understand. How are they worshiping God? The God of the daytime is still God in the nighttime. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. That same God you worship at high noon is the same God that you worship when the time is midnight in your life. That same God that created the heavens and the earth with His spoken word, Elohim, the Creator God, is that same God that you serve and live for today. That same God that provided for Abraham when he was about to offer Isaac as a sacrifice, provided a lamb caught in the thicket, and that's where we get Jehovah Jireh from, the Lord will provide. It's that same God you serve. That same, all of those Old Testament scriptures where the shepherd would lead the sheep and he would care for the sheep. Jehovah Rohi, He's the Lord our shepherd. Psalms 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He is the one who guides us. He's the one who cares for us. He is the one who has compassion on us. It's that same God today that we serve, that's talked about all through the Old Testament. It's that same God with that same power. That same God that is going to stir up an earthquake here for Paul and Silas is that same God you serve today. And if He could do it yesterday, that means He can do it today. But for Him to show up in your life today, there's got to be a little bit of faith there to where you worship Him and you seek Him. Not that you understand, not that you can wrap your head around it. I can't understand, God, what you're doing. I don't like, God, what you're doing. But I submit and I surrender my all to you because I realize that you are the only one who can help me and get me through this midnight in my life. They were singing praises to God. Second of all, point B, they were shouting praises to God. Not silently, they were shouting. As I said a moment ago, we will trust you, we will serve you, we will not forsake you, God. Remember Job said, though he slay me, yet I will trust him. See, they were getting their worship on in the midst of midnight in their life. They were getting their worship on. And the prisoners were listening, the guards were listening. And this is what we need to always remember. Somebody's always listening and somebody's always watching. Somebody's always watching you go through your struggles in life. Somebody's watching you that don't know the God that you know. They're watching you and they're listening to you. And they want to see how you navigate through that. They want to see, okay, it's midnight in your life is falling apart. You're being watched by somebody even when you don't realize it. Somebody has their eye on you. So the midnight time in your life, get this, the midnight time in your life might not just be for you, it might be for somebody else also. Because as they watch you go through it, their life is going to be changed. But not only that, there are some things you go through at midnight that you can be a minister for on the other side of that you would not have been able to before. Because you've been through it. You know what it feels like. You know what death feels like. You know what separation feels like. You know what the loss of a kid feels like. You know what the loss of a parent feels like. You know what the divorce and the pain that it brings. You know that. But you didn't know it before midnight. You didn't know it till you went through the pain and the pressure and the heartache. But now you're on the other side of it. God has put you back together. God is ministering to your heart, and you still might not look back and like all of those things that happened back there, but you know that you are where you are today because of God, and God has put you where you are today to minister to somebody and encourage somebody that is going through the exact same thing God has brought you to the other side of. Then notice point C, the sudden power of God. Isn't it always good when you're there in that midnight hour, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, suddenly a burst of God's goodness just shows up in your life. I mean, at midnight sometimes, when you've been there for a while, you haven't seen, it's almost like you haven't seen the goodness of God in quite some time. So when this sudden burst of God's goodness invades your life, man, it is God, and it is God on display, and it is God being glorified right before your very eyes. God's intervention brought change, shift in power. You see, a lot of times when you're sitting there at midnight, it's like, like Paul and Silas, they were chained. They couldn't do anything. They couldn't go anywhere. They were chained up. And a lot of times at midnight, we just feel like we can't move. We can't do what we need to do. But when we're praying and seeking God, and God intervenes with His goodness, what happens is that there's a shift that takes place. Sometimes even when we're not acting like we're under the midnight experience and under the trial, sometimes we just feel like we are. We just feel like, man, this is a burden. This thing's just wearing me out. This thing's just pushing me down. And when you get that sudden burst of goodness that you've been looking for, then all of a sudden in your life, even though it may not have been this way, all of a sudden it feels like you're on top of what has been beating the daylights out of you for weeks and months. Now all of a sudden it feels like victory is yours. Not a greater feeling. Number 3, the midnight miracle. Some of you need a miracle this morning, and you need to know that we serve a God of suddenly. The suddenly moments in your life, just as suddenly as you found that midnight, is just as suddenly as God can show up with His goodness and His power and deliver you from it. Just as quick as you got there, you can get out. Let's look verse number 26. And suddenly there became a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison and the house were shaken. And immediately all of the doors were opened, and every one's chains were unfastened. Man, that's like a God earthquake with some divine purpose of unlocking and unfastening chains. So in other words, we've been set free. We can run. God has set us free. Don't miss this. Sometimes when God delivers us from midnight and He sets us free from those chains that we've been chained up to, we immediately begin to run off because we're so excited that we literally run off and miss what God wants to do in our lives for others at that very moment. So in other words, we'll get so tickled and so thrilled that God did that for us, and we're on the other side of it, that we'll quit coming to church. We'll get up on the mountain. You know how it is when you're on the mountain? You feel like you don't need God. That's why you got to go through the valley. Because that's what God is trying to show you right now in the valley. God is trying to show you in the valley right now and in the midnight, when you make it back up to the mountain, when you make it through the transitional phase that I've got you in, don't forget that the God on top of the mountain is still that same God in the valley that just put you there. And I put you on that mountain for a reason and for a purpose. Notice the guard had to watch over these two prisoners. He knew all the chains had been loosened, and he literally, verse number 27, when the jailer had roused out of his sleep and had seen the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, supposing that the prisoners had escaped. But Paul cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." And he called for lights and rushed in trembling with fear and fell down before Paul and Silas. Notice, this whole midnight experience happened for this jailer. Paul and Silas singing their praises to God, shouting their praises to God, testifying about God's goodness. Somebody was watching them, and you know who was watching them? The guard was. And I'm sure the guard was sitting there thinking the whole time, how can they be serving God? How can they be honoring God? How can they be lifting up the name of God in this dark dungeon? I mean, they might even be put to death. How can they be doing this? And then when it became personal to the guard that they did not escape, notice the first thing that the guard does is he falls down on his knees and he says in the very next verse, "What must I do to be saved?" What must I do to know this Jesus that you know? Man, I got to know this Jesus you know. Well, first of all, I don't see how in the world you could have been lifting up His great name in the midst of this fiery trial. And second of all, man, if your God can cause earthquakes with this kind of specificity, y'all like that? I didn't say that right, but anyway, you know what I meant. He was just like to the point. Y'all like that? Y'all laughing. Y'all go ahead and laugh at me. It's all right. Y'all going to be up here one day and I'm going to be laughing at y'all. It's going to be, but Ben, he always laughs. He makes videos and laughs at me. But he falls down on his knee. Now notice, verse 31, not just the jailer's going to get saved. You know who's going to get saved? His whole household is going to get saved. You know how they're going to get saved? It's because Paul and Silas had to go through a midnight experience in their life to where God was honored and God was lifted up and God shown Himself to be the mighty God that He is. He's a miracle working God. Do you believe that this morning? If you do, you can have point number 4. You don't want this, but it's good to have. It's called Midnight Memories. My story. See, my strength is at midnight, I can't get through this struggle any other way than, man, God's got to come through. He's got to make a way. That's my strength. It's God, and it's God alone. And when God brings you through that midnight, there's going to be a memory there that you'll never forget. There's going to be a story, a testimony, because there was something in your life that you could not solve. You couldn't go to the bank, get a banker, put it off for a little while. You couldn't maneuver, manipulate. You couldn't do anything. But you prayed, and you sought God, and you worshiped God in the midst of the darkness. And God brought you through the transitional phase, and you saw the sun rise come up in the morning. And it may have been 6 months down the road, 4 years down the road. Midnight lasts a whole lot of different times, according to what God is up to in your life. But you've seen the light, you've got a memory, and you know how faithful God is. You know He's a God who can heal because He healed you. You know He's a God who can provide because He provided for you. You know He is a God who can forgive and mend relationships because He put your marriage back together. When everybody else said it was dead, He put it back together, and it was all God. It wasn't you. You know He's a miracle working God because He resurrected your career. your business was about to die, and he resurrected it, and he not only brought it back, you're soaring right now because of what God has done in your life, and you can testify to that because you've lived it. You've went through it, and you know it is all God. I don't know if I share this on a Sunday morning or not. This message here, this midnight, really has emphasis for me because I can't even remember how long ago it was now. 3 or 4 years ago, my wife was diagnosed with, well, first of all, she gets this bad mammogram. And, you're thinking, we're young, we're thinking, no big deal. You just go, you get another one, they'll just say, yeah, just one of those photo moments that just didn't come back right. Well, my wife went through a lot when she was younger, and I didn't realize this. She didn't tell me this till just recently. Her mother died at 36 with lung cancer, and her dad died at 44 with pancreatic cancer. So she said the whole time she was 35, that's all she could think about was that whole year. Well, she was going to get cancer. She was going to get cancer. And then when she went from 35 to 36, she says, whew, I'm to the other side of it. And then 44 came. She said, all I wanted to do that whole year was get from 44 to 45. And that whole year, she said, I thought about it the whole year long. And it was in late November that she was diagnosed at 44 with breast cancer. See, I didn't know that. She didn't tell me all this when it was all happening in the moment. But she had that in her mind because of what she had went through. And now God had brought this, and I know that this is why I always say that my wife is like so incredible, because she never said it was unfair. She never said it was unjust. She never complained. She never murmured anything, but just trust for God. And that would have been hard to do, knowing that I lost my mom and dad so young, and knowing that I was just 44, and now here I am in this boat. God, this ain't fair. So immediately she makes the decision, both of them boobs are coming off. And I'm like thinking, but we got $5,000 invested in those already. Y'all got to realize this is how we get through struggles in our home. We laugh. Because, when she was first diagnosed with this cancer, she had it in one. And I just sitting there one night and I said, honey, if you looking that good with one of them and one of them, you need to get it in the other one, because, man, you are looking good. We just got to laugh about it. That might be crude for some people. But for us, that's the way we cope and the way we get through it. As we trust God, we just laugh about it. But anyway, God was just so faithful through that midnight. And she had to have the surgery, and I find out, we didn't know that Carol was coming after that, Darlene was coming after that, another Darlene was coming after that. We didn't know all that was coming right behind us. But now, even me, I'm able to minister to when I have other people tell me, man, I know the stats. Man, I read everything. I know about whether it's hormone driven or not. I know negative, positives. I know the stats of the odds of whether or not you got it or not. And the odds are really for you, not against you. God might choose for you to be the one of the 10%. I don't know. But more than likely you won't be. But if you do, the God of the daytime is still God in the nighttime. And I've seen God be there for us. And the reason why I say that is because that was really the I'd say the second or third midnight that I've ever been through. I was 44 years old with my wife. I always thought those other things were midnight, but those other things weren't midnight. Man, this was midnight. The possibility that I could lose my wife, that those kids that I had to look at every day could lose their mom. So I decided early on, as God used this passage of Scripture in my life, that I only had one option. That was to worship God. because he was the only one that could help. So yeah, you worship God when you lose your child, because he's the only one that can get you through it. You worship God when you're diagnosed with a health issue that could take your life, because he's the only one that can intervene in those moments. But I'm here to tell you, it's a transitional phase, because God is doing something in your life. You say Greg Kirkland don't know it, but you know, we're just coming off Upward. Y'all just saw that Upward video, and I didn't even tell him this on Friday night. We talked a little bit, but Upward, we just went through 3 months to where I feel like there has been nothing we have ever done in this church up to this point that has had the impact that ministry has had in our church. I mean, the banquet, the celebration that all ended it this past week. I mean, the overwhelming vibe that I've gotten from all of these families that have come is, man, your church, your people, man, the love that y'all have displayed. I mean, it's just been an overwhelming testimony, not about us, but about Jesus. And I watched him, and he was giving the devotional through the video, and I know Albie made him look better than what he really was. He took out all of his rabbit chases and all of that. But, man, I was sitting there watching him as I sat back in that back booth, and I thought, I wonder if he didn't go through that midnight, would he be doing what he's doing now? The man has sold his nicer house, moved in a smaller house, so that they could get in a position to where God could use them more in ministry, because that's what he wants to do. He wants to be a minister. He wants to preach, wants to lead. Yeah, there are some people that want to do that because they feel like God, that's their calling in life. But I thought, if he didn't go through that, would he be where he's at right now? So there's a lot of things God is doing in your life right now that are good and godly and great that he wouldn't have been able to do if he didn't go through some tragedy and some pain and some heartache. Just worship him. I might not have an explanation for you. I might not have an answer for you. But just worship God. Just worship him. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. God, I will worship you and I will seek you when my heart is hurting. And when I don't know what's on the other side of this, I'm going to worship you, God. And I'm going to honor your great name. My wife is 48 today, by the way. 4 years the other side of it. And she doesn't have to think about no more moms and dads that died at a certain age. She's 4 years past that. God is good all the time. Let's stand and bow our heads.